what group of animals I am talking about, this slimy group of animals. I see a couple hands raised. Miss Murphy, do you want to call in someone for me?
Raleigh.
Amphibians. Yay, exactly. So we're going to be looking at amphibians. And the reason that I get really, really excited about amphibians, probably too excited about amphibians, is because we are living in Georgia. And believe it or not, Georgia has one of the largest diversity of amphibians in the country. So especially right here and about an hour north of us, kind of towards the Macon and Warner Robins area, we have the largest amount of diversity because we have over 40 species of amphibians just here in Georgia. So that's a lot. And it's because we have the great conditions for it. We're warmer than a lot of other places. And then we also have a higher humidity. So it makes it easier for these animals to be able to survive. Well, what I figured we'd do is I'm going to get started. I've got a quick slideshow to help kind of show and demonstrate some of the things that make amphibians special, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to focus in on what makes an amphibian and how they might be different than our other vertebrate groups. Then we will meet our different groups of amphibians because it's actually a really big group with over 7,000 different species of animals. So you may be thinking frogs and toads, like, oh, cool, there's like 10 of them, but there's over 7,000. And there's probably hundreds of species that we may have never even met that might live in tropical rainforests or areas that have yet to be discovered. So let me do a quick screen share with you guys so that you can see what I'm looking at. And can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So let's first and foremost kind of move a little bit forward and kind of cover the obvious. So amphibian, believe it or not, their name actually describes one of the things that makes them so special or so unique. And their name amphi means dual or two. And so the reason that they get the name amphibian is because they have a dual life. So who can tell me what amphibians start out as?
Egg.
Okay, they do. They start as eggs, but what about when they hatch out of those eggs? Where do they live?
Tadpole.
I heard tadpole. That's a great example. And a tadpole is a great example of a larval form of an amphibian. And you'll notice that I use the word larval because we have more than just frogs and toads that comprise our big group of amphibians. We also have things, we'll see them in a minute, like salamanders and Sicilians. And their babies are also in the larval form. So larval means that these animals, when they're younger, larval means that they are living in the water, that they are adapted for an aquatic lifestyle. So that's one life that they're living, right, underwater. Then what happens, I know you guys know this because you've been learning this since like second grade. What's that big word that starts with an M that all amphibians go through?
Metamorphosis.
Metamorphosis. I heard it out there. Exactly. Then these animals go through metamorphosis, and that's what you can see right here in my little chart. We can see that they start out as eggs, and then they develop into tadpoles. You can see that they're growing legs, losing their tail, and then boop, they pop out and they live on land. Sounds a lot more simple than it actually is. So this is their second lifestyle. So they start in the water as a larval animal, and then they develop and they grow and they live on land. So this is where that name amphibian comes from. It means dual life because they live two totally different lifestyles. Now, they have some really special characteristics that allow them to do this. So I'm going to go through some of the basic characteristics that make amphibians special and allow them to live this double life, this like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type lifestyle. So for starters, let's look at some of the characteristics that they have when they're living in the water. Some things are kind of obvious. Like look over here at this guy. What does this guy have to be able to pull oxygen out of the water?
Gills.
Gills, very good. So gills. Gills are what a lot of animals use to take oxygen out of the water. You'll notice I didn't say breathe. And that's because breathing is what we do on land. Okay. They have lots of blood vessels like veins and arteries that are really close to the surface. And so as the water runs over it, they literally just pull oxygen out of the water. So amphibians, as a larval form, adapted to live under the water, have gills. Some of the other things that might make them a little bit special. So look back here. What is this on the back end of my tadpole?
Tail.
A tail, exactly. So they've got a paddle-like tail that they're using for swimming. Something that maybe isn't quite as obvious, but if we were to look on the underside of a little pollywog, which that would be a little larval amphibian that we have swimming underneath the water, one of the things you'll notice is they have this little curly-Q stomach. And then on the underside, his mouth right here, you see this specialized mouth part. Well, when amphibians are in their larval stage, they're actually plant eaters. So that's kind of weird because when you think about frogs and toads living on land, what do you think of them eating?
Flies.
Yeah, like flies, bugs, things like that. So when they're on their larval stage, they're actually an herbivore. And then as they grow and they become an adult, they turn into carnivores. So that's pretty cool. It's something that you may not necessarily think of, but as a larval form, they have a stomach that is specially designed to digest plant material. Now, like we said, as they get older, they go through this metamorphosis. And during this process, they develop the skills to live on land. So this is where we start getting into some of the really neat things that make them unique. All right. So there are some animals that we know of that live in water, right? Like fish. Okay. But our amphibians have now developed the ability to live on land, which is way more complicated than you think about. Even if a fish had lungs, if you brought him onto land, even if he had lungs to breathe, do you think that he'd be able to survive?
No.
Probably not. So one of the things that I have pulled up here is I've actually pulled up a frog skeleton. And that's because when these animals are developing the ability to live on land, you'll notice that their skeleton is actually specialized. So right up here, this is called the pectoral girdle. And then if you will feel on yourself right here at your neck, you have a collarbone. You feel that? Your collarbone is also developed to live on land. And then where your legs connect to the rest of your body, there's that special little bone that's in there called the pelvis, right? Yeah. Okay. On the frog, that's right here. It's called a pelvic girdle. Okay. So the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle on amphibians are way more specialized than in a frog. And that's because it's way harder to support your body on land than it is in the water, right? Show of hands, has anybody ever gone swimming before? Oh, I see a lot of us have gone swimming. I love it. Swimming is one of my favorite things to do. So when you get in the water, it's kind of easy to move around, right? You just kind of float, right? You're floating around. And then when you get back on land, all of a sudden, all your body weight, you put that body weight back on those bones or that pressure back on your bones. And so frogs and toads, in order to live on land, have developed these specialized bones to be able to support the weight of their whole bodies. So that's pretty neat things we have going on. Now, some of the other things that are going to make amphibians unique is their eggs. So if we look at their eggs, kind of looks a little bit like fish eggs. Unlike reptiles that we've met or birds that we've met, our amphibians aren't quite as good as getting away from the water. So basically what that means is even though they can live on land as an adult, they still have to go back to the water. They go back to the water, A, to lay their eggs, and then B, frogs and toads, I want you to look at the outside of their skin. I said that we would be looking at the slimiest, right? That's because frogs and toads are pretty slimy little critters, and that slime protects them because frogs and toads have got to stay moist. And if they don't stay moist, Sometimes it makes it hard for them to breathe because it's so cool. When they come onto land and they develop lungs, they still actually breathe through their skin because they've got a number of blood vessels, veins, and arteries that are really close to the surface of the skin. And as long as they stay wet, they can pull oxygen out of it. Now, that mucus on the outside of their skin also helps to protect them. It's got antimicrobial properties. So that means that, kind of like if you get cut, you put Neosporin on maybe, it is going to help to kill things like bacteria and viruses. So it offers a protective coating for that frog. But again, they still have to stay moist. So that's why oftentimes you find frogs and toads thriving in areas like a pond, a stream, a wetland, or here in Georgia, where it's just humid all the time. They tend to do very well here. So now that we have a better understanding of what it means to be an amphibian, let's meet some different groups of amphibians. All right, so here's my tadpole. Okay, so we have 3 major groups of amphibians. Okay, what's the first one right here?
Frog.
A frog, exactly. So one group of amphibians are frogs and toads. That one's probably the most obvious, and we're the most familiar with them. So we'll actually come back to them. We'll discuss them in depth at last. Then we have another group. Does anybody want to guess what this group is?
Salamanders.
Oh, you guys are too smart for me. I like this. Salamanders, exactly. So we have a group of salamanders, and they look a lot different than our frogs and toads, right? So salamanders, you can see they have a much more long body. As an adult, you can see that they retain that tail. Okay. And then, oh, question, I'm sorry.
Can I get the kids started on lunch? We're listening, but
Oh,
I'm
yes, ma'am.
after our lunch out.
Absolutely. So we have our salamander right here. And then in that group of salamanders, we'll meet some other animals that fall into this category. And then the third group, which is the one that you're probably the least familiar with, this is not an earthworm. This is something called a Sicilian. So this is not like your pizza, like your Sicilian pizza with all the delicious sausage and pepperoni. This guy is a Sicilian, and he is a incredibly ancient type of amphibian that looks really funny because he doesn't have any limbs at all. He almost looks more like an earthworm, and they're commonly mistaken as an earthworm. So let's dive into it. Let's see what makes some of these different groups of animals special. So my first group would be my frog or my salamanders. So salamanders represent about 600 different species. And I've got a lot of really cool photos down here of some of my different salamanders and the crazy cool things that they do. So some animals in my salamander family, like this guy right here, this animal's pretty special. This is what we call a newt. And you may be familiar with a newt, but they're so crazy cool. They start out in the water in a larval form, just like this guy right here. This is actually a tiger salamander. But when newts are babies, they start out just like the rest of amphibians, this larval form, and then they turn into what we call an F stage. So that's what this guy is doing right here. And an F, it kind of sounds like elf a little bit to me, but it's not an elf, very different. That's EFT. And they go out on land and they have this like land journey, sometimes for 7 or 8 years. And then this is actually like their teenage years. So kind of like what you guys are going through right now. So then what they do is they actually go back to the water as adults. So you may have gone to the pet store before and you see like little newts in there. Okay. And the adult newts, they have lungs, just like the frogs and toads we know of. But they have that time where they go out, they spend time on land, and they're kind of cool. I've never found one in the wild, but I really, really want to. We have a couple species of newts. I lost them. Oh, you're back. Yay, I thought I lost you. Can you guys still hear me? I'm going to keep going. I hope you guys can hear me. So I have got, like I was saying, my newt friend right here. when they're on land to protect themselves, they're so cool. They're actually really, really toxic. Just licking them or touching them could be enough to give you a stomach ache. And then for some animals, it can actually prove toxic or it could kill them. Now, one of the other neat things that some types of salamanders do is some of them are tricky. Some of them are like Peter Pan and have decided that they are never going to be an adult. They're never growing old. And that would be like this animal right here. We actually have two species of sirens. In Georgia, we have a lesser siren and a greater siren. And what you'll notice about the siren, this is actually full-grown siren. What do you see hanging out on its sides?
I'm sorry,
guys-
Miss Jackie.
Oh, you're fine. Do you guys see this frilly stuff right here? What is this?
Ears.
Ooh, that's a good guess. Ears, because it is right there. But what might this be? This frilly stuff right here. Would those be gills? Yeah, that's weird, isn't it? Right? Because we said that adult amphibians have lungs. Well, some types of salamanders are tricky, and they are what we call pediamorphic, which basically means that they have tricked their bodies into staying young forever. So they stay in the water for their whole life, and they retain those gills instead of morphing or changing into that adult and then developing the lungs like we saw earlier. Another really cool species that I have right here, this is a giant type of salamander, and he has got lungs, just like some of the other frogs and toads we looked at. But unlike some of the frogs and toads, he has a unique way of breathing. So this newt, when this newt becomes an adult, he lives underwater, but when he needs to breathe, he actually goes to the surface of the water, gulps air, and then dives back down, like a frog. Sometimes you'll see frogs do that in your pond. Well, this guy right here is what's called a hellbender. And we have them in North Georgia. They're really big. They can be 12 to 16 inches long. So they're quite a big amphibian. And if you look at him, you'll notice that he's got all this saggy skin. That's normal. That saggy skin, he's got all those loose folds in his skin because he breathes through his skin. So they live in cold mountainous areas with fresh flowing water all the time. And as that water rushes over his skin, it allows him to take oxygen straight out of the water. And then one of the last ones, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that I can share something different with you guys. I'm going to show you a really cool type of amphibian that we do have here in Georgia. And we actually have one at the Flint River Aquarium. So let me try and figure out how to pull it up. I'm going to stop real quick. And then I'm going to pull up. Exit this. So let me do a quick screen share again. Hopefully it'll work. And I appreciate how patient you guys are being. I know that you guys are probably better than me at technology, but this is another type of amphibian called an Amphiuma. And a lot of times people call them ditch eels or Congo eels. And so they're really, really funny looking. You can see that they've actually got tiny little bitty arms. They look like a cartoon almost. And he's got two little bitty fingers, and he uses them to kind of push along the bottom of the tank that he's in, or this is what he would do to move around in the wild. And now what's cool about him is you guys see how there's a color difference between the top and the bottom? If you were to look really close at him, you would see almost like little pinprick lines. And those pinprick lines are actually what allow him to detect changes in the water. So he can detect changes in the movement of the water or the chemistry of the water with those little lines because those are sensors. So those are connected to nerves. If you look at them up close and personal, they almost look like they have a big goofy smile. They're super, super slimy. They're very ravenous carnivores. And I definitely suggest not picking them up if you find them in the wild, because despite this smiley looking grin, they've actually got a number of jagged teeth in there that they use to shred their food, like crayfish or sadly, sometimes other tadpoles, fish, and insects that they find. Now, let's look. We're going to see one more type of salamander that I've got right here. And can you guys see the new video that I pulled up, or do I need to share again?
Oh, we see it.
You see it? Okay, so you see my little marbled salamander? Yay, so what I've got here is I have got a marbled salamander, and this is a native species of salamander that we have right here in Georgia. So these salamanders are pretty neat in that this is the adult form, so you can see that he's got the 4 limbs to walk around on land like we saw with other salamanders. But what he likes to do is he doesn't live in the water all the time. He actually comes to live on land, but he likes to live in wet or moist areas to keep his skin nice and moist. So he likes to live near wetlands, streams, ponds. A lot of times you can find animals like this. If you like flip over rocks, you'll find them hanging out underneath where it stays nice and moist. And what's kind of cool about these animals is when it comes time for them to reproduce, is they will actually lay their eggs in an area that doesn't have water yet, lay their eggs, and then wait for the rain. They're called dry bed nesters. And then when the rain comes, it fills up that ditch or that wetland, and then it surrounds the eggs, keeps them nice and moist, and then allows that developing embryo or baby salamander inside to continue to develop. So they're really cool animals. All right, so we're going to move on to my next group of animals, and let me do a new share with you guys so that you can see. All right, and can you guys see my slides again?
Yes, ma'am.
Yay. So my other group was the Sicilian. We had talked a little bit about them earlier. We said they're really, really weird, really, 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 really funky. And right here, this one is an aquatic Sicilian. So if you look at their body design, they don't look like they're very good walking around on land, do they? Probably not. These aquatic ones right here, they still have lungs. So they do go through that whole metamorphosis and they've got lungs. Unfortunately, sometimes they've sold them in pet stores before, and these are very carnivorous ones. So you want to be very careful of what you buy in a pet store, because sometimes people will buy Sicilians, not knowing they're Sicilians. And then when they come back home, they find that they only have 1 Sicilian instead of 5 fish and a Sicilian. So when you look at them, like I said, they're funny, funny, funny looking. Their eyes are really, really tiny, like almost non-existent. They're almost completely blind. So what they use to detect what's going around in the water is those little dots, like I was telling you about on the Amphiuma. They have them too. So they can detect actually changes in the electricity in the water, which is so crazy. So that's how they can interpret their world. You'll also notice that they don't have anything back here leg-wise, and their tail looks kind of like a paddle. Now over here, we have a different type of Sicilian, and it looks like an earthworm, but if you look right up here, you see those 2 little spots? Those 2 little spots are his eyeballs. This Sicilian is meant for burrowing. And so that's why they don't have limbs, is they don't have limbs because these animals are typically found underground where they like to burrow. So that's where we like to find them. Now let's move on to our very last group, the one you're probably all familiar with, right? Which group is this? Frogs and toads, exactly. And so what I've got up here is I've actually got both toads and frogs. Now, frogs and toads are our largest group of amphibians. There are over 5,000 species of frogs and toads worldwide. So an incredibly diverse group. We find them almost everywhere that we have tropical or temperate type of temperatures. And then now, the neat thing, I know that we said it includes both frogs and toads, but technically speaking, all toads are frogs. All right, so all toads are frogs, but toads are specialized frogs. So it's kind of what I like to think about it like squares and rectangles. So technically, all squares are rectangles, right? They've got 4 sides, but not all rectangles can be a square because squares have to have 4 equal sides and 90-degree angles. So it's kind of similar in that all toads are frogs, but not all frogs can be special and cool like toads. So some of the things, the easy things that make them able to distinguish, or some of the things that may set them apart. One of the most obvious things for me usually, toads tend to be more land dwelling. And because of that, they have a thicker, bumpier skin. So that thicker, bumpier skin helps keep more water on the inside of their body so they don't dry out than what you see with frogs. Now, it kind of looks like it's going to fool you a little bit because if you look over here at this frog, this is a gray tree frog that we have here in Georgia. You may notice he does look a little bit bumpy, but his bumpy skin isn't as thick as this toad skin is. Okay, so that's one of the things that make them different. Then also, if you look at their legs, toads are not exactly built to be like athletes like frogs are. Like they're not the ones that can jump 6 feet in one bound. Toads are a little bit more close to the ground. They're still really awesome animals. They're just not quite as good at that. Now, the other really neat thing about them that you can set them apart with is I want you to look right back here behind his eyes. You see these big puffy bumps? Those are his poison glands. So all amphibians are covered in poison. Some are more toxic than others. Obviously, dart frogs, you really don't want to lick those. You probably don't even want to touch them. But the frogs and toads we have around here, I don't suggest eating them or licking them. But if you did, you're not going to die. You just may have a stomach ache for a little bit. So poison glands are also different in frogs. Their poison glands, they have little bitty ones that are all over their body. In toads, their poison glands are actually concentrated behind their ears right here. And then that's why if you've ever made a toad really, really angry, you'll notice like right behind his ears that he develops this like foamy stuff. And that's actually him when he gets stressed, he secretes that poison or lots of poison with that mucus. And that's what creates that foamy white looking stuff coming out of him. Now, we have spent a lot of time looking at different types of amphibians. And now I thought it would be pretty fun for us to meet an amphibian. So I'm going to stop my share and I am going to let you guys meet one of the amphibians from our collection. Now I'll take him out in just a minute, but he's quite hoppy. He likes to hop, hop, hop very, very fast and make a fool of all the education staff members. This is a splendid tree frog. Now my splendid tree frog right here, he does not live here. He likes to live in New Zealand. So he is a really cool animal. And you'll notice that he's a lot bigger than some of the frogs that we would have here in Georgia. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull him out and we'll look at some of those amphibian features. And then we'll also look at some of the features that makes him special as a frog. Now we have a number of different splendid tree frogs. Some are on display at our reptile house. One of my favorite things about this frogs, and these are totally just because I think they're adorable, is I like to call them bloopy frogs, because if you look, they've just got this big bloopy look, and they've got these really nice big jowls right here.
Oh my God.
Right? Is he not adorable? I love frogs and toads. Believe it or not, so in 7th grade, frogs and toads were my favorite. So I actually did my entire science report on frogs and toads and went to the science fair and everything. So I used to run around outside in my backyard and I would catch all the frogs and toads I could find, and I kept them for like a week or two so that I could study them because I just think they're that awesome. Now, fingers crossed that he doesn't pee on my laptop because, you know, that's not fun. Well, so as you can see, he's pretty slimy looking. Oh, there he goes, peeing on my laptop. So as you can see, he's pretty slimy looking. Oh, yep, there's a lot more. So he's pretty slimy looking, and then he's actually gotten a lot more slimy as we speak. And the reason that he did that is as a defense mechanism, okay? It sounds kind of weird, but think about it. You know, if somebody was trying to eat you and you peed on them, they probably would decide you didn't sound very tasty anymore, right? I told you he was hoppy, right? And he's able to hop so well because he's got that specialized pectoral girdle and pelvic girdle that allows him to launch himself very, very well. Now, some of the other really cool things, I'm going to get him really close to my camera. Fingers crossed he doesn't pee again. I want you to look at him breathing. Do you see him breathing? Yeah. So it looks different than us, right? Look at your neighbor. Do you see your neighbor's throat moving up and down? No, not really. That's because frogs and toads, they have something called buccal breathing, which is really neat. So essentially what they're doing is they're opening up their throat. And when they do that, it forces air into their throat. And then when they push back, it pushes that air into their lungs. So that's a really unique adaptation that these guys have, along with salamanders. You'll see salamanders do this too. It's a little bit different than us. With us, at the very bottom, you've got lungs, right? In the very bottom here, you've got this thin sheet called a diaphragm. And the diaphragm actually does the same thing as his throat does. When you need to inhale, your diaphragm pulls down and it helps pull air in. And then when you exhale, it goes up. Obviously, you don't have to think about doing it. We can just see it a little bit easier on him. So I was saying he is very slimy. Now, another really neat thing about amphibians is that because they have that really, really thin skin, they can absorb so much through their skin. Not only can they breathe through their skin, like we said, but they can also get toxins through their skin. This is why scientists focus on amphibians so much if they're exploring a new habitat or a new area, because if they go there and they find that the amphibians have like 5 legs and 4 eyeballs, that tells them that it's maybe a toxic environment. And so that's one of the reasons that scientists have this huge push to discover all these amphibians and make sure that their populations aren't lost. And that's why we study them so heavily. Now, one other really cool thing is when they eat, I want you guys to watch a frog or toad next time they eat. This is what I used to like to do, is I used to like to watch them eat on my window. So I would leave the lights on at night and that would attract the bugs, right, to the light. And then I would watch the frogs come and eat. And when they eat, if you watch them, their eyes close. And this is the coolest thing. These are the only animals that do this, but frogs and toads actually use their eyeballs to help them eat. That's weird, right? Not just looking at them, but their eyeballs actually push into their skull. So when they go to eat, their eyeballs sink into their skull and help push back into his home. So, so they use their eyeballs to push the food down their mouth into their throat. Right? Is that not awesome? I told you amphibians are like the coolest animals ever. All right. So clearly my amphibian is ready to go home, as he is indicated by jumping back into his home. Or this isn't actually his home. I call this his to-go box. He has a nice big home in our education animal care area. So I'm going to put the top on before he escapes. And then I can take any questions that you guys might have. And I thank you so much for being so well behaved and then even hanging out with me during your lunch. I really appreciate that. I see a question in the back in the blue.
Stand up for your question so she can speak real loud.
How do their eyes fall back in their skull?
So unlike us, you know, we've got bones behind our eye. Like if you look into a skeleton, but they don't have bones behind their eyes. So I've actually got a cool skeleton right here. Let me see if I can line it up. See how there's just holes? And his muscles allow for his eyes to go into his skull. Now, obviously there's a membrane that's going to separate it. So his naked eyeballs don't go into his skull, but the membrane still stays under it and it just helps to push it. Awesome question.
Any more questions?
Do I have other amphibian questions?
Riley? She said, how do they get their slime?
Oh, that's a great question. So they have glands all over the outside of their body, just like you have sweat glands. And those glands produce the slime. And so they just excrete it out of their body.
Questions about amphibians? I think that's everybody's questions, Miss Jackie.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys joining me today. Hopefully you enjoy your lunch. Hopefully I didn't ruin it with the eyeballs and the slime and the grossness and the mucus that they're covered in. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you.
Thank you.